Good afternoon, dear guests and viewers of Rīga Conference. My name is Uģis Lībietis, and I'm a journalist and head of the foreign news desk in Latvian public radio. It's a real pleasure to be here in the Rīga Conference and to speak about, I would say, let's call it an elephant in the room. This conference room is quite empty right now, but let's talk about the big elephant that is getting bigger and bigger with every day. And let's talk about China. And some approximately 10 years ago, my colleagues started to ring alarm bells about the expansion of China influence in the world, that we will soon see a huge influx of Chinese people and workers. Well, I don't know, luckily or not, but these prognosis has not fulfilled for 100%. We still see some small communities in here and in other countries, but still, we can't say that discussions about China has disappeared, and we can say for sure that on a global perspective, China is present, I would say, everywhere and in all the discussions. And mostly, of course, because of the economic influence, but there are still different other aspects we are talking about probably less and probably are not paying enough attention to that. So this discussion will be dedicated to those issues regarding China and its influence in this region and also globally. And that is why it's my pleasure to introduce you to Associate Professor of the Arctic University in Norway. It's Marc Lanteigne. Nice to meet you.
Good to meet you. Thank you.
At first, I guess some viewers might ask the question, how does it come that a Latvian and a Canadian is talking about China and speaking from Latvia? What do you think, why it's relevant to talk right now and right here about China and its influence?
Well, first of all, thank you very much to the Riga Conference. To start off with, I think that we are seeing signs pretty much everywhere that China has made the transition from regional power to global power, and its influence is being seen in many poor parts of the world, including the Arctic, including Northern Europe, and including many other parts of the world where it was simply not present. So to discuss China is to really be discussing an emerging global power.
Usually when we speak about China, we think of its economical might, and some years ago we were thinking about different technological advances, about 5G technologies that were creating some concerns for people around Europe and also world. But still, if we add also right now that the climate change, we can also shift a little bit attention to the Arctic region, which is becoming more and more significant in the last years in the latest discussions. And how has the geopolitics changed probably in the Arctic region as well?
No. Very good question. And I would start off by saying that it is very clear now that the Arctic has transformed itself from a very local concern to an international one. Because of climate change, because of the fact that what is happening in the Arctic does not stay in the region, and because more of the Arctic is becoming accessible in regards to resources, energy, shipping, many non-Arctic states are getting interested in this part of the world. And I would say China is at the forefront. China has made it very clear that even though it is not an Arctic state, it wishes to be an Arctic stakeholder, and it wants to play a better role, not only in regards to economics, but also potentially to governance.
You mentioned two aspects, economical thing and the government aspect, but what about the military factor probably in this region? We know that Russia, the big Arctic country, together with China has organized military exercises in a couple of last years. And now there are also signs that there might be some increase of the presence of Chinese forces, also the Russian forces in the Arctic region. How do you think, how important is this aspect?
Yeah, China has tried to convey the idea that its interests in the Arctic are primarily, as you would say, civilian in nature. But you're correct in the sense that we have seen incidents of the PLA Navy operating both off the coast of Alaska and well as the Baltic region, Northern Europe. And it is clear that China sees the Arctic as being of great importance. And if China wishes to be taken seriously as a regional player, it also has to show the flag in a way. But that said, one of the big questions that we're still dealing with is whether Russia and China's Arctic cooperation, which has extended into the economic realm, there's been talk about scientific cooperation, to what degree is that going to be acceptable from a military viewpoint, especially since Russia is obviously very concerned singly about its own Arctic sovereignty.
You mentioned this cooperation between them, and I think it's also might be considered as a competition from certain perspectives. Do you think which of those factors could take the upper hand, competition or cooperation?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Like, the relationship has been referred to as a sort of marriage of convenience. Given the opportunity, Russia would like to engage in many partners, including in Europe, to help develop its Arctic resources, but that is simply not possible at the moment. So China remains its primary development partner for projects such as the Yamal liquefied natural gas enterprise. But Russia is very concerned that what China is seeking in the Arctic goes beyond what Russia would be comfortable with. Like, Russian officials have been saying for a good 10 years now that while we welcome the participation of China, we welcome the participation of non-Arctic states, we are the Arctic states. We are the ones that should be setting the agenda. So how that is going to translate into what areas of partnership will and will not be acceptable, especially considering the amount of emphasis that the Putin government has placed on developing Siberia, developing the Russian Far East, it needs Chinese economic assistance. But to what degree is Moscow willing to deal with China wanting to more directly insert itself into the region?
Some commentators might say that we already can speak not about the Russian far east, but already a Chinese Western Russia or something like that, because the investments and projects already there are very wide in a scale. You mentioned natural gas, but Arctic region is also might be considered rich with other natural resources. And if during this pandemic we saw a shortage of different materials around the world, and all the supply chains are strained, I would say. How important is this factor of natural resources in the Arctic? Because I think that all the Arctic countries are not hiding their willingness also to invest, to develop their abilities there. How about China's willingness to do that?
Yeah, as more of the Arctic opens up to economic activity, the issue of metals, minerals, rare earths has becoming more prevalent. China is a major exporter of many rare earths, and in some cases it has a near monopoly. So what has been happening is that many countries, including in Europe, are looking for alternative sources. So they're looking to Greenland, they're looking to other parts of the Arctic to do that. But again, who is in a position to better develop these resources? Who is in the best position to develop joint ventures in order to actually extract these rare earths? And as you say, this is not just an economic concern, it is also a strategic concern.
Getting back to probably security issues, one of the things that I already mentioned in the beginning, a few years ago, we were concerned about different security aspects from the technological side, from China's technologies like 5G technologies and possible spywares or privacy breaches, etc., etc. And there are also news that probably some activities from Chinese side in this security area is also concentrated right now in the region which we were mentioning before, the Arctic region. How would you characterize the I don't know, spying activities, security activities from Chinese forces or associated to them in this region?
Well, the first issue here is that even though the Chinese economy still has a reputation for being one that is still based on manufacturing for export, China has made some very significant leaps in the area of high technology, not only in regards to 5G, but I would add quantum computing, artificial intelligence. It is very interested in blockchain applications. And all of that has raised a lot of questions about not only competition with the West, competition with the US and Europe, but also China's ability to set standards. And Huawei, the whole kind of question of over using Huawei for 5G platforms, that's just, I would say, an opening salvo on what is going to be a very interesting tech competition between the West and China. Now, because many Chinese firms, including Huawei, have been cited for having very close ties to the Chinese government, there is the question again about security. What is the security of using these particular applications, these particular companies? So that leads to the issues of espionage, the issues of the problems that one would see as China wishes to set these technological standards.
Yeah, and this probably explains why it is also significant to us as a NATO member, because most of the Arctic countries are also the members of NATO. And by the way, I really, right now, I realized why it's important also for us, because Riga, for example, is a little bit closer to the Arctic Circle, like capitals of United States or Canada or even Arctic state Russia. We are more Arctic country than the others probably, because without the clear getting to the region. But still, should these concerns of security be more activated in regarding to the future perspectives of NATO, if we consider of future strategy of NATO? We talk a lot about disinformation, misinformation, hybrid warfare. How important is this Chinese factor? Because mostly we speak about influence probably from Russia or from other countries, but specifically Chinese.
Yeah, well, as the Arctic continues to become, as I said, an international concern, as we are going to be starting to see, for example, increase in shipping, increase in concerns about the access to resources, we're starting to see some differences of opinion over Arctic sovereignty. All of this is starting to factor into what is China's longer term role in Northern Europe and in the Arctic as a whole. What is it seeking? First of all, it is definitely seeking to be accepted as an Arctic stakeholder. It wishes to be taken seriously in issues of governance, including questions about security. But at the same time, China is aware of the fact that many other countries, including the United States and its NATO partners, are also starting to get serious about the Arctic as a security concern. And the fact is, China is still very much a newcomer to the Arctic, and still in many cases has to tread very carefully, not only in regards to getting more knowledge, but again, its partnership with Russia is very much contingent on Russian goodwill. Russia holds a lot of the keys to what China is seeking here.
But if we speak about the last couple of years, and I would predict that this discussion will continue in next years, the climate aspect is getting involved in more and more subjects and more and more spheres. And we know that European policy in the future is oriented to integrating all these green course, Green Deal ideas in every aspect of life. How can the green questions influence the situation in the Arctic region? Also, the green questions influencing relations with China.
Yeah, it is really being understood now that just looking at the Arctic and its climate over the past few years, we are seeing so many changes just in terms of day-to-day weather, rain instead of snow, much warmer days, wildfires in places that would have been unthinkable. So again, Siberia, Greenland, northern Canada. So the evidence continues to mount, and many governments in the Arctic and indeed throughout much of Europe are now starting to look at these issues much more seriously and are starting to look at the importance of international cooperation to deal with all this. Now, China has been put into a very interesting position because during the Trump government, this was a government that refused to acknowledge climate change at all and attempted to basically withdraw from any kind of multilateral discussion on the subject. And that left China, interestingly enough, as the largest country that was advocating for environmental cooperation. So China, even though its own environmental record is still very much a work in progress, China has been trying to put forward the idea that, okay, we are the most positive force for environmental cooperation. So it gets noticed in that area. And even at that, China is such a major contributor to issues of pollution and issues of carbon and so forth today, that any kind of agreement without China is simply not going to work. So one way or another, China has been placed in a very distinctive position and certainly can't be ignored when countries in Europe and elsewhere start talking about serious deal making on this subject.
Just recently in Russian Energy Week, President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, was actually very keen by saying that one of the ways how to increase the European energetic stability is to help Europe with deliveries of natural gas from Russia through its newly built gas pipelines. And you already mentioned before that one of the things where China's probably help is needed is investments in technologies, also in gas sector, in oil sector, etc. in the future. And some experts are pointing out that Russian technologies themselves have been quite out of date, I would say, and that Chinese probably are more advanced in this situation and probably more powerful in economic way. How do you think how these investments in green technologies might develop in the future, and how important will be the Chinese factor? Because people are, let's admit, every country is actually looking for cheaper technologies and better technologies, and they can, China can afford them right now and propose them.
Yeah, well, on the subject of Russia, Russia has been putting a great deal of emphasis on developing its Arctic regions, and that includes developing the energy capabilities that we see in Siberia. That means that the ability to get the natural gas, to get these resources out to market becomes key. And that's where the Polar Silk Road comes in. That's where Russian cooperation with China to develop infrastructure, to encourage shipping, all of that becomes paramount. Now, the problem is Russia got a series of very nasty wake-up calls over the past year, not only in terms of wildfires, not only in terms of environmental degradation, but the incident at Norilsk, the fuel leak there, which was blamed on the loss of permafrost in the surrounding area. That was a very, very strong indication that Russia simply can't have its cake and eat it too, that it can't continue to develop the region to the degree that it has and ignore the environmental impact. And now that Russia is chairing the Arctic Council, it is going to be under even more pressure to show that it is taking the Arctic situation seriously in regards to environmental responsibility. So because China is so embedded in many of these projects in Siberia, there's also going to be a lot of discussion about how the two countries will be able to develop these areas while still being environmentally responsible.
China has been very famous for its new transit initiatives in the region, also in Europe, and I think that it's not a secret that like every country would be interested to get a share of those railroad cargoes coming through their countries further to the west, etc., etc. However, this perception of China has changed also during these years, and more and more countries are getting cautious about the true ambitions and true aims of China in this region. How do you think the perception of China has changed if we speak about the influence of transport, logistics, and the easy money that everybody is hoping for from China?
Yeah, well, this is a kind of a combination of the fact that China is now seeking to expand its Polar Silk Road. It is looking to the Arctic as kind of its northern tier of the BRI. Sorry for the cross noise. We have now, though, China really wanting to expand that polar Silk Road outside of Russia to other parts of the Arctic. It is seeking to, as you say, develop potential road and railway projects in Northern Europe. There was even some discussion about potential Chinese investment in the tunnel between Helsinki and Tallinn. In northern Norway, there's been discussion about finally setting up a railway that would allow for transportation between Kirkenes and Rovaniemi, potentially hooking up to Russian lines. And all of that has been looked at with a great deal of caution because of the concerns about, well, what is this going to do in regards to Chinese debt, and what is this going to do in terms of security concerns? So a lot of these very grandiose projects remain on the drawing board. Part of it is because of economics, part of it is because of security.
Just recently, I heard a discussion about the influence of China in Eastern Europe and in so-called post-Soviet countries, or I would better prefer the term Eastern Partnership countries like Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia. And we know the political situation in these countries might be very fragile or changing from time to time. But some experts suggested that China is very effectively using the weaknesses of those countries by offering cheaper and valuable and easier to access possibilities for those countries. And the methods are very different, by using the situation in corruption by just buying politicians, or just offering better tenders in different infrastructure projects. And the conclusion was that those countries might use the China factor as a blackmail for, let's say, better advantages from the European side, for example. Europe can offer something more, but we will use this China card as a trading point. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I would say that China, and again, looking at the example which you brought up about 5G technology, that China has been very good at advertising these kinds of communication platforms at more competitive prices, more competitive features. But the fact is, there's been a considerable amount of pushback, including in Europe, towards, first of all, the kind of longer-term financial considerations, as well as the issues of security. Now, China has also specifically targeted Central and Eastern European countries through initiatives such as what used to be the 17+1, in order to really demonstrate that it wants to be seen as a key economic partner for these countries. But the fact is, we are starting to see so much political concern being expressed that we're almost starting to see a return to the idea that perhaps these platforms should, reflect better security areas, to reflect better kind of local concerns, rather than just, well, this was the lowest bidder.
And the other conclusion from that discussion was that probably in Europe, this understanding of these possible threats is getting better and bigger. But in this closest neighborhood, this understanding is still not so big about China, its intentions, its ambitions, about projects, methods they use. How do you think, what should we do probably to increase this awareness, to increase this understanding of China and its position in the world right now?
Well, I would add to that by saying that Chinese foreign policy has undergone considerable shifts over the past few years. We are starting to see less of an emphasis on, for example, peaceful development. We're starting to see China behave, you can call it more assertively, you can call it being a little bit more reactive to any perceived slights. We have seen quite a few countries, including, for example, Sweden and Lithuania, be subject to some Chinese diplomatic criticism over various policies. So there needs to be the understanding that China is starting to become less patient with dealing with countries that they feel are not giving it proper attention, giving it proper diplomatic protocol. Now, how to deal with this? Well, I think the first step would be to understand that China is now starting to become much more comfortable with its great power and potential global power status, and that it is very concerned about keeping its position at closer to the top of the global hierarchy. And to understand China as being a great power, as being a potential global power, is very key. But the other point to make is that China is still very much learning about many aspects of international politics. Compared to, let's say, the United States, China has had a much smaller amount of time to adjust to its very large status. And it is still going to be very dependent on the goodwill of many countries in order to continue to grow and develop. China is not the Soviet Union. China simply cannot disconnect itself from the global economy and expect to flourish. And even just over the past few weeks, we're starting to see some very serious cracks, if you will, in China's economic system, the situation with Evergrande and the situation with China's banking, to really understand that China still has a great deal of development to go, and it still has a great deal of foreign policy development to go. So there needs to be the understanding of China as a great power, but one which is still trying to address a lot of gaps, a lot of challenges, domestically and internationally.
I think that to conclude, it would be probably interesting to introduce a new term like developing great power. It would be the right description for China. Yeah. And I remind you that we were talking to an associate professor of the Arctic University of Norway, Marc Lanteigne. Thank you, Professor, for your time and being with us.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.